Richard and Claire seemed like the perfect couple. But behind the walls of their luxurious mansion, years of secrets, abuse, and resentment were building toward a violent end that no one could have predicted. Their 20-year marriage, once admired by many, spiraled into jealousy, rage, and a gruesome murder that shocked an entire community. Richard had always been known as the man who had everything. His name carried weight in business circles. His estate stood like a monument to wealth, and his presence commanded respect at every social gathering. When he married Claire, a woman of grace and quiet beauty, the union was seen as perfect and ideal match of power and elegance. Their wedding was celebrated on a grand scale, with guests marveling at the luxury on display, convinced they were witnessing the beginning of a lifelong fairy tale. For Claire, who had come from a modest upbringing, the marriage was more than just love. It was the promise of security and a chance to live a life far beyond what she had ever imagined. In the early years, their marriage looked flawless to the outside world. They traveled often, attended elite parties, and hosted glittering events in their sprawling mansion. Claire played her role effortlessly, admired for her sophistication and composure. Richard enjoyed the praise that came with being a successful husband, and together they became a fixture in their community, envied by those who longed for their lifestyle. Yet beneath the glossy surface, an unspoken tension was already beginning to grow. The couple remained childless, a fact that was quietly noted but rarely questioned aloud. At first, Richard brushed aside the concerns, telling Claire that children would come in time. But as months turned into years, impatience seeped into his voice, and frustration colored his every glance. He had always dreamed of an heir, someone to carry on his name and inherit the empire he had worked tirelessly to build. Without that, he felt incomplete. Claire sought medical help, enduring endless appointments and invasive treatments, in hopes of fulfilling his dream. Each failure weighed heavily on her, and every negative result seemed to push Richard further away. The once tender moments between them became strained, replaced by a distance that grew more obvious with every passing year. Claire still clung to the hope of mending their relationship, convincing herself that love and perseverance could heal the growing rift. But Richard's affection began to fade, overshadowed by a cold resentment he did little to hide. While in public, he maintained the image of a devoted husband. In private, he grew increasingly bitter, viewing her inability to give him children as a personal betrayal. As time passed, their home became less a place of comfort and more a stage. Guests still marveled at the grandeur, but when the doors closed and the lights dimmed, silence and tension filled the vast halls. Claire buried her pain, hiding her tears behind polite smiles, while Richard immersed himself in work and social obligations. Anything to avoid confronting the emptiness between them. What the world saw was a wealthy, powerful couple living a dream. What they didn't see were the fractures spreading through the foundation of their marriage. The fairy tale that began with glittering lights and promises of forever was already unraveling. 20 years of love and loyalty lay ahead, but so did years of anger, disappointment, and a darkness that would one day end in tragedy. As the years moved forward, the cracks in Richard and Claire's marriage widened into deep fractures that could no longer be hidden. Richard's wealth and status gave him the ability to present a polished facade to the outside world, but within the mansion's walls, the truth was darker. His frustration over their childlessness hardened into cruelty. At first, it came as cold silences that stretched for days, moments where Claire felt invisible despite sitting across the same dinner table. Then, the silences turned to sharp words, criticisms that cut into her with precision, reminders of the one thing she could not give him. Claire bore his anger in silence, still clinging to the belief that if she remained loyal, if she tried harder, Richard might find the love for her that had once existed. She surrounded herself with distractions, pouring her time into redecorating their home, volunteering for charities, and keeping her appearance flawless. But none of these efforts softened his bitterness. His wealth grew, his businesses expanded, yet instead of gratitude or joy, resentment grew with them. The lack of an heir gnawed at him relentlessly, a wound that never healed. Behind closed doors, Richard's anger escalated. The criticisms became threats, and soon after, the threats became physical. A shove during an argument, a grip on her arm too tight to ignore, A slap delivered in rage, these moments blurred together into a cycle Claire could neither stop nor escape. She concealed the bruises carefully, mastering the art of makeup and long sleeves, refusing to let outsiders see the truth of her marriage. To the staff, her trembling hands and hesitant footsteps told a story she'd never put into words. They suspected but remained silent, fearing Richard's wrath and knowing his influence could ruin their lives with a single command. For Claire, the house became a prison draped in gold. Chandeliers sparkled, its halls were polished. Yet she moved through it like a ghost, her laughter gone, her spirit dimmed. Invitations to galas and dinners grew fewer as she withdrew from society, while Richard offered excuses about her health. Friends whispered their suspicions, but never pressed her. Choosing to accept the image Richard carefully maintained rather than question what lurked behind it. In Richard's eyes, Claire had failed him completely. He saw her not as a partner, but as the obstacle that denied him the legacy he craved. The weight of 20 years of disappointment twisted his love into hatred. He began to justify his cruelty as punishment she deserved, convincing himself she had stolen from him the future he was entitled to. The control he exerted over her became absolute, stripping her of the independence and light that had once made her so admired. The marriage, once envied by many, had become a hollow shell. Richard continued to thrive in public, while Claire withered in private. Each day under his roof chipped away at her hope, leaving her clinging to survival rather than happiness. What began as a life filled with promises had transformed into years of quiet torment. A storm building beneath the surface of their grand estate. That storm, left unchecked, would one day break loose in violence so brutal it could never be hidden again. Claire's world had grown unbearably small, yet even within its suffocating boundaries, she began to search for ways to reclaim a sliver of control. She started writing in secret journals, documenting her pain and recording the bruises that never seemed to fade. These journals were tucked away in drawers and closets, hidden between old linens and books that Richard never touched. Writing became her only refuge, the single place she could release her fear and rage without consequence. In her words, she confessed to herself what she dared not admit aloud. Her husband was breaking her, and she did not know how much longer she could endure it. Richard, meanwhile, drifted further into his obsession with control. Business deals brought him more fortune, but they did nothing to soothe his wounded pride. His desire for children had twisted into an obsession, and every time he saw families or heard colleagues speak of their heirs, it enraged him. He began surrounding himself with younger women, whispering promises of what his wealth could offer them, feeding his ego with their attention. Claire suspected his infidelities, but by then she was too beaten down to confront him. Her silence was not acceptance, but resignation, a recognition that fighting him would only provoke more violence. The staff of the estate grew more uneasy as Richard's temper became impossible to ignore. Raised voices carried through the halls at night, followed by the sound of breaking glass or hurried footsteps. Once a maid entered Claire's room to find her sitting on the floor, clutching her ribs with tears streaming down her face. But when asked what had happened, Claire only shook her head and whispered that she had fallen. The staff knew better, yet fear of losing their livelihood kept them from speaking out. Richard's power extended beyond the walls of his mansion. He had allies in high places who would never question his word over theirs. Despite the fear that consumed her, Claire began to imagine escape. She secretly looked into properties far away from Ohio, places where she could start fresh under another name. But every attempt was thwarted by the realization that Richard's wealth gave him eyes and ears everywhere. She feared he would track her down no matter how far she ran. Still, the idea of freedom lingered like a faint flame, flickering in her heart, even as everything else dimmed. As months passed, Richard's anger deepened into cruelty, so cold it terrified even him. He began speaking openly of his disappointment, reminding Claire daily that she was worthless in his eyes. His wealth had given him the means to control her every move, and his fury fueled his determination to remind her that she could not leave him without consequences. To him, she was no longer a wife but a possession, one he had the right to break. The marriage had crossed a line from misery into something far more dangerous. Claire's journals became darker, her words carrying the tone of someone who feared her life might not last much longer. The staff tiptoed around the house, each day wondering if the next outburst would end in tragedy. Richard, consumed by rage and haunted by his unfulfilled legacy, began plotting in ways that would soon unleash horrors no one inside the estate could have imagined. The stage was set for violence that could not be undone. Claire's worst fears were slowly coming true. The breaking point came quietly, as if it had been waiting in the shadows of Richard and Claire's home for years. Richard's growing infidelities no longer satisfied him. Instead, they fueled his bitterness, making Claire the constant target of his rage. Each day he seemed more unpredictable, pacing the halls with an intensity that unsettled even the most hardened staff. His obsession with the idea of an heir consumed him. He muttered to himself about being mocked by his peers, about dying without leaving behind a name that would carry his empire forward. His pride had curdled into paranoia, convincing him that Claire had not only failed him, but had somehow betrayed him. Claire felt the tension in the air every moment. Meals were no longer shared, but endured. Silent tests of endurance where the scrape of cutlery seemed louder than words. She avoided him whenever possible, retreating into her room, hoping his temper would burn itself out. Yet her instincts told her something had shifted. The bruises had grown darker, the punishments harsher, the control more suffocating. She began to fear that Richard's cruelty was not simply the release of anger, but a deliberate descent toward something far worse. Richard's wealthy friends saw none of this. At social events, he smiled, shook hands, and charmed, all while painting Claire as a devoted wife who preferred the quiet of home. No one questioned why she appeared less and less at his side. To the outside world, they were still the enviable couple, living in luxury that others only dreamed of. But inside the mansion, Claire lived on borrowed time, trapped in a nightmare that was steadily closing in. Her journals reflected her growing terror. The once measured words of sorrow had turned into frantic entries that documented threats Richard had made, moments where she believed he might kill her. She wrote of his eyes, how they no longer looked at her with anger, but with something colder, something that stripped her of humanity. In her final entries, she wrote of a premonition that her life would end violently in the home she had once thought would keep her safe. The storm finally broke one late evening. Richard had returned from a business dinner, his mood sour and his temper short. The details of that night would never be entirely clear, but what was known came from the shattered evidence left behind. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing against the walls. Inside the mansion, staff froze in fear as the violence escalated. The confrontation, which had begun like so many others, spiraled out of control with a ferocity no one could stop. What followed was a night of brutality so severe that it left even seasoned investigators shaken. When the violence ended, the grand estate stood eerily silent, its chandeliers glowing softly over a scene of horror. The life that had been built over 2 decades of marriage collapsed in a single night of rage. The husband who had once promised love and protection had unleashed a level of savagery that no one could have predicted, leaving behind not only devastation, but the beginning of a story that would horrify everyone who learned of it. The morning after the violence, the mansion that once radiated wealth and status was cloaked in an eerie silence. It was a house too quiet, as though it already knew what had unfolded within its walls. The staff, paralyzed by fear, hesitated to step inside the main wing, but when they finally did, they stumbled upon a scene so gruesome it was beyond comprehension. Claire's lifeless body lay broken, the extent of the injuries revealing a level of rage that could not be mistaken for anything but deliberate murder. Blood stained the polished floors, a grotesque contrast to the elegance of the surroundings. Richard was nowhere to be found. Authorities were called immediately, and the case drew instant attention. A wealthy businessman with a murdered wife was a headline that spread like wildfire. Investigators arrived swiftly, securing the sprawling estate and piecing together the timeline of events. What they uncovered painted a disturbing picture. The staff, though hesitant, eventually admitted to years of violence, whispered accounts of bruises and screams they had ignored out of fear. Hidden among Claire's belongings, detectives found her journals pages of confessions documenting years of abuse and her growing belief that Richard would one day kill her. These entries became the foundation of the case, a haunting voice from beyond the grave that laid bare the truth of her suffering. As investigators searched for Richard, rumors swirled. Some believed he had fled the country, using his wealth and influence to disappear. Others insisted he was hiding nearby, too arrogant to believe he could be caught. His absence only fueled public outrage. News outlets framed him as a monster who had spent 20 years tormenting his wife, a man who valued legacy over love and power over humanity. Public sympathy poured toward Claire, whose tragic fate exposed the facade of a marriage once envied. It took nearly 2 weeks for authorities to locate Richard. He was discovered in a remote cabin owned by one of his associates, disheveled and unrecognizable from the man who had once been the polished face of wealth. His capture sent shockwaves through the community. During interrogation, he showed no remorse, insisting Claire had humiliated him by failing to provide an heir. In his warped perspective, the murder was the final punishment for 2 decades of what he considered betrayal. The trial was as sensational as the crime itself. Prosecutors built their case around Claire's journals, using her words to narrate the horrors she endured. Photographs of the crime scene, combined with the testimony of the staff, painted a damning image of a man whose obsession had consumed him. The defense tried to argue temporary insanity, claiming Richard's desperation for children had driven him into a spiral, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for only a short time before delivering a guilty verdict. Richard was sentenced to life in prison, without parole, stripped of the empire he had built and the respect he once commanded. The mansion, once a symbol of success, was left abandoned. A grim reminder of the brutality that had unfolded within its walls. Claire's journals were preserved as part of the court record, her words ensuring her story would never be silenced. In the end, the marriage that began with promise and luxury ended in horror and bloodshed. Richard's legacy was not the heir he had craved, but the infamy of his crime. Claire's tragic death stood as a haunting testament to the dangers hidden behind closed doors, where wealth and status could mask years of violence until it was far too late.